Indian-born author Salman Rushdie is fighting for his life on a ventilator. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. These are the images that have shocked the world. As Rushdie was about to get started with a speech at a public event in New York, a man reached out to stab him, not once, but multiple times. Rushdie has lived in the shadow of death for decades after a fatwa was declared against him by Iran's supreme religious leader because of the Satanic Verses, a book that has evoked protest from many Muslim groups across the world. It is a book that is banned in India. In fact, tragically, India was the first country in the world to ban the publication of this book. What has happened to Salman Rushdie has raised questions for free speech across the world. It is also a chilling reminder that these threats cannot be taken lightly, and there are those who actually displayed the courage to stand by their principles. Rushdie, and he's somebody I have known professionally and personally over the years, has never minced his words, never pulled his punches, never diluted what he had to say because of these threats. Ironically, this assault has come to him in the land of the free, in the United States of America, where he had perhaps falsely come to believe that he was safe. There are all kinds of questions that emerge from what has happened. And Rushdie himself believed that free speech should be absolute. But not too many are prepared to back that principle even today. Will India, the land of his birth, finally stand unequivocally with Salman Rushdie? Or will we see that all too familiar competitive selective cherry picking of your free speech versus my free speech? This and much more to discuss with four of the finest writers joining us today, all of them from the United States of America, where this assault took place on Salman. Sadanand Dhume, author and columnist with the Wall Street Journal, joins us. Great to see you, Sadanand. Also joining us is Aatish Taseer. Aatish Taseer, of course, is an author and somebody who's not been able to come back home to India. That, of course, is a whole separate debate, but somewhere all of these dots do get joined. Also joining us is Salil Tripathi. Salil Tripathi is, of course, a senior journalist, but has done exemplary work with pen, raising the issues of free speech. So great to see you, Salil. And finally, Amitava Kumar. Amitava Kumar, of course, is also a writer and author and commentator. Great to see all of you. And I want to start actually with just saying that all of us hope very much that Salman Rushdie, who's on a ventilator according to his agent, who may lose sight in one eye, gets past this somehow. But Salil, there are many, many important things for the world to pause and consider here. There are questions not just of free speech, but also violence in the name of faith. Some would say also the failure of progressives and liberals to stand by Salman Rushdie as unequivocally as should have happened. And today, Rushdie perhaps has paid the price for that. Your first thoughts?
Well, my first thought, very honestly, is that I want him to be safe, healthy, happy, and smiling and back home at his desk so that he's writing his next novel and many more novels to follow. That is my first thought, that my only uppermost thought today. I've known him since 1981 when Midnight Children came out. Uh, there are so many of us who believe we can own our history, own this language, and write what we want because of what he did and what he made it possible. So we just want him to be happy and healthy and back home. Of course, it raises the issue of free speech and freedom, but we don't have to look very far for that, frankly, because his life has been his message. If we read his work, whether it is in Imaginary Homelands, whether it is in Step Across the Line or Languages of Truth, the three monumental collections of essays that is in. I'm not even going into Harun and the Sea of Stories and the Land of Gup and Chup and, of course, Satanic Verses, which are all testaments of the 20th and 21st century's thinking of enlightenment. He's a scholar, he's an extraordinary writer, great raconteur of tales, and a magnificent storyteller. And all he tells you is that if you don't like my book, write another book, write a better book, counter it with argument. When you don't like something, you have to debate it, you have to challenge it with words. And it's I mean, it's the irony. I hate using the word irony here, but the sad reality is that he was speaking at an event in upstate New York. It should be clarified, it was upstate New York, not New York City, at an event where he was talking about writers from Ukraine and elsewhere who are facing problems and need a safe haven. And he was going to talk with another person from Philadelphia about how to create asylum cities for writers. And that's where somebody who could not bear the idea of someone writing and speaking freely. Someone was born a decade after Satanic Verses was written, and which a book which he has probably never read, chose to take the action and the steps he did, which is terrible. It just shows that the threats that Salman told us about are with us all the time, and this battle will just continue to be with, and we'll have to keep fighting and draw inspiration from his magnificent words.
And of course, we sort of, share your hope that he'll be back to writing soon. But, Aatish, if something like this happens, does it not become a voice in your head telling you to watch what you say and what you write the next time around? His agent has already gone on record to say that Salman may lose vision in one eye, that his liver has also suffered damage. He was stabbed multiple times. As Salil points out, this 24-year-old was not even around when this fatwa was declared by Ayatollah Khamenei. And my question to you is, do we not have to start unpacking what brought us to this moment? What brought us to this point? And I know it's a very meta question, but I was seeing two kinds of comments on social media today. One, a lot of right-wing groups calling out sort of Islam as distinct from Islamists, and others saying that secularist progressives had also failed Rushdie, with a lot of ifs and buts and not unequivocally standing with him. Your thoughts?
I mean, this is somebody who always, even when he was, when he was the subject of an attack charged with blasphemy, very much like my father was charged with blasphemy, his position was always that he always expanded the argument. He always brought in history. He brought in the history of the French Revolution, and he saw like the people who were the philosophes, who saw that the clergy was their enemy and that they had to fight that in order to win the right to freedom. So again, like, I think that, one should almost say it as Rushdie would, which is that he would stand back from making it a sectarian thing. And he would sort of look again to the history of humanism, to a sort of universal right to speak, and see that those enemies array themselves time and time again in different societies, and they wear different garbs. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to distill the moment into the fact that it can happen, that every faith is capable of wearing this kind of garb. And the thing that for me, like, that I find really heartbreaking is that this country, which was founded on the philosophy of the Enlightenment, was the country where he felt safest. And he always sort of had a kind of attitude where he thought, the press, nation states, politicians, these people were like almost the greatest danger to him, because they could whip people up into a frenzy. And that if it was left to individuals, or if it was left to people, he would always feel, I once asked him, I said, do you feel unsafe in New York? New York has all kinds of people living here. There are, that anyone, there could be somebody who takes him in a taxi who doesn't. And he said, it's never happened. And so it brings, it's sort of, yeah, it is replete with irony, and very painful for me, at least, to consider that this place that had felt so safe to him is now suddenly sort of a sort of place of threat.
Yeah. So that in the politics has taken over swiftly, even before Salman Rushdie can get better. In India, it is the familiar fault line between the right wing and the left wing, or the liberals. Elsewhere, it's the familiar fault line in terms of Islam and where you locate that orthodoxy. And once again, that distinction between talking about Islamists and Islam seems to fail many. When you hear Salil and Aatish, do you largely agree with them, or do you believe that all of us as progressives, as people who believe in free speech, also need to step up and, in a way, look at what led us to this moment? How did we reach this moment? The fact is that Salman Rushdie has not been able to come in and out of a country like India as freely as he'd like. I remember 2012, he was supposed to first appear in person, then speak via video conference at the Jaipur Literature Festival. I was the moderator, he was not able to do it. I'm not even talking about the Rajiv Gandhi government that first banned satanic verses. I'm talking about as recently as 2012. He was not able to come to the land of his birth because of some mob that the state decided it was not going to contain. Sadanand.
Thanks, Barkha. But obviously, I agree with what Salin and Aatish have to say. I mean, they're both old friends. They both have very deep and heartfelt commitment to free speech and enlightenment values. But I do think that what happens to many of us, and by us I mean people who are broadly can be called liberals. What happens to many of us is that at moments like this, we're wearing two hats. And obviously, we care about this moment. We want Rushdie to survive. That's the most important thing. But a little part of us also wants to ensure that this moment is not used by bigots who are anti-Muslim bigots to smear all Muslims or to victimize Muslims or to attack all of Islam and so on. And I think that the problem is that when we wear that second hat, we end up inadvertently sounding a little mealy-mouthed to the average person who may be watching this. I think we should have no problem saying that, look, yes, of course, any faith tradition or any belief system is capable of producing fanatics and violent fanatics. But we should also acknowledge that at this moment in time, in 2022, the kinds of fanatics who are stabbing authors in the neck in New York happen to emerge from the tradition of radical Islam. That is not all of Islam. It is a particular interpretation of Islam. In this case, it seems to be a particular interpretation which was backed by the Shiite theocracy in Iran. But we should be able to talk about that very forthrightly. We should be able to condemn it specifically for what it is. And at the same time, point out that this does not in any way justify any kind of blanket attacks on the faith of more than 1 billion people, or the idea that because this Islamic fanatic did this, that somehow it makes all Muslims culpable. So I think we need to be able to talk about what this is, which is a very specific ideology, which is engendering a particular kind of violence, which is quite unique in this moment of that we face today. And at the same time, be careful not to allow this moment to empower bigots who want to use this to smear all Muslims.
And briefly, before I go to Amitav, in the reactions that you've seen thus far from across the world, but in particular from our part of the world, where do you think the debate has landed so far?
So, I mean, obviously you have the, rabid Hindu right, which basically has, two things. One, it wants to sort of use this as a moment to say that, well, look, this is what Islam is, and this is what all Muslims are, and so on. And they also want to use this to point to what they see as the hypocrisy of liberals. And I think that liberals should not give them that win. We should not allow them to point to this as a hypocritical. We should, at this moment, not equate this particular political ideology and the violence that emanates from it with other problematic political ideologies. There is a place and there is a time to have those discussions, and those are certainly valid discussions that all of us have had. But today, I know, with a person who appears to be some kind of Shiite fanatic who was inspired by Khomeini, has, when those seem to be the facts that are before us, that's the issue that we need to address plainly and squarely.
Let me take that to Amitav. Amitav, the questions we ask right now are important. Obviously, at a personal level, we all hope he gets better. But what do you say to what Sadanand has said?
I think Sadanand's point is somewhat problematic, frankly. But first, I should say that the wonderful, widespread outpouring of grief and goodwill for Rushdie is very touching, and just gives us, all of us who are well wishers, strength. The reason I'm differing a little bit from what Sadanand was saying is simply that when we try to, in an attempt to distance ourselves from those who we call bigots, what we should not forget is that in India, in the country about which, where we owe our origins and what we are talking about, let's say Parshuram Vagare shooting bullets into Gauri Lankesh is a reminder that it is, bigotry, certainly right-wing Hindu fundamentalism, that has led to attacks on writers and intellectuals. So quickly or simply in this context, if we only focus on one faith, what we are not talking about is the rise of global, on a global scale, the rise of fundamentalisms of different colors, which threaten writers and journalists. So that is my quick response, because that is what we must be. When you asked the question at the beginning of the show, will India rise in solidarity? I want to say, yes. Will it rise in solidarity both in support of Rushdie and, as he would want, in support of writers and journalists who have been thrown behind bars or who are being murdered by fundamentalists of various sorts?
Okay, let me open this up. Salil, you've heard a lot of very sensitive and complex points made here. Your response?
In
Can we
broad
unmute?
agreement with
Yeah.
everything that, and Aatish, Amitava, you and Sadanand are all good friends. So, this is a conversation among friends. So the differences, if there are any, are, how will I put it? They are not personal, but they are on issues. So I just want to say that clearly. But I want to emphasize what Amitav just said. And social media forces us into what is called whataboutery. And this is not about whataboutery, but I'm really, really glad he mentioned Gauri Lankesh's case. But there is also Narendra Dapolkar, there is Gobind Pansare, there is M.M. Kalburgi. So my point is that, other faiths, I don't even want to name faiths here, don't have a clean and crystal clear record. The government that claims to be Buddhist in Myanmar has just executed 4 people, including 2 writers. Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, who is probably a Christian, was blown up by someone putting a bomb in her car, obviously by other people who were Christians. So this is not unique to one particular faith. By that, of course, you'll probably be able to find some statistical analysis to show that these things happen. And we know about Charlie Hebdo because it's so sensational, and we know about this attack on Salman. But it is not as if those who are, takes me back to Khalil Gibran, who said, when you point one finger, remember that 3 are pointed towards you. And I think that's something really worth bearing in mind, that this is a problem about reason and faith. And faith has to be questioned not with illogical argument, but I'm quoting Salman here. Faith has to be questioned with doubt, and the enemy of faith is doubt. And the ability that we can doubt, question, argue, think, reflect, and write our own perspective. That's what makes us different from the other species who are not able to do so. And we have to attain to reach those higher selves of ours. And after all, what is religion? It is an idea. Christopher Hitchens, the great friend of Salman, I knew him too, used to say that it's just an idea, and ideas can be debated. Salman also says that ideas are to be debated and challenged, and I think that's what we should focus on.
Do you agree with Sadanand that there's an element of sort of, very cautious political correctness in the commentary so far, Salil?
Who you're talking about, I'm not, to be honest, I've not been tracking the commentary that has come out. But what Susan Nossel of PEN America said yesterday, Stephen King, Neil Gaiman, Ian McEwan, and if you see statements like that have come out, they've been forthright. Now, they're not, I agree, they're not Indian voices, and I've not looked at what Indian writers have said. And if Indian writers fail to rise to the occasion and don't speak up for Salman, they're not only doing a disservice to Salman, they're doing a disservice to free speech and their own heritage, because so many of us are able to write and get space in the international arena because of what Salman has done. He has opened the doors for us. And if we do not, speak up and stand by him at this time, those who do not do so should be embarrassed and ashamed.
Aatish, I would say the commentary in India at an institutional level, at an official level, has been actually unavailable. There have been, individual voices, a Shashi Tharoor, an author here, an author there. But really, literally, there has been no official state or political or governmental response. But I'm sure that doesn't surprise you.
No, it doesn't, and it's a scandal and I think that disowning, and one has to wonder, like, why is Salman Rushdie sort of disowned in that way? Do you know, like, and I've certainly felt that kind of disowning too, and I hope there isn't a religious angle there. I hope it isn't that, like, because who could be a more Indian writer, and why isn't senior leaders in the Indian state outraged? And I just wanted to say one thing vis-a-vis Sadanand's point is, I have no trouble saying that an extremist radical Islam attacked Salman Rushdie yesterday, killed my father a decade ago. Like, I have no problem saying this, but the problem is that when you say just that, it seems like the reason for why that ideology got radicalized lies in the book or lies in the faith. And maybe certain faiths are more susceptible to being radicalized, but I think that there is an experience of a shared experience of modernity that has radicalized all kinds of ideologies. And especially in the last 20 years, we've seen white nationalism come roaring to the surface here. We've seen very, very gentle Indic religions. There's almost been a kind of longing to turn them into something more, something that could serve as a better cudgel. So I think that when one gets to this sort of root causes, or when one gets to this sort of world in which ideology gets radicalized like this, the more interesting discussion lies in a certain shared experience rather than the particularity of one faith.
I think that's a really important point, and I want to bring in Sadanand on that. But before this, I actually want to take out 3 quotes from Salman. I had the occasion to interview him several times, but this is after his video link gets cancelled at the Jaipur Literature Festival because the government fails to protect him. And he says a vast majority of Indian Muslims don't give a damn whether I come or go. These are just comments that he made to me that I thought were relevant to today's discussion. And he went on to make the point that, in a way, Aatish was making, that the assault on liberty sometimes comes from Hindu extremists, sometimes it comes from Muslim extremists, and both are equally to be condemned. And this was really important because this was in the aftermath of his own talk not taking place at that Jaipur Literature Festival, not because of the festival organizers, but because of the failure of the state. And then, of course, in the same interview, he talks about the real enemies of Islam, the Deobandis, the extremists. And he goes on to say it is these men who strengthen the image of Islam as intolerant, repressive, and violent. And therefore, they are the real enemies of Islam, and not me, Salman Rushdie, who's been cast in that role. And it's a role he said he found ridiculous. So, Sadanand, I want to bring you in at this point that, I think Aatish makes an interesting point that at a time when you have people walking into schools across the United States of America, blowing up classrooms. Why do we look at that differently and not in the context of a religion or a faith in the way that we look at what's happened with Rushdie? And of course, the point Aatish makes is important, that religions of the book that are strenuously codified possibly lend themselves more to that kind of radicalization. But even so, are you making a meta point that Salman Rushdie would not make himself?
No, I don't think I am. No, and I think that I'm glad actually that we have a small amount of disagreement on this panel. Otherwise, it was too many people with too many similar views. I have no problem having that larger conversation that Salil and Aatish and Amitava allude to, right? And you can sort of step back and look at the planet and see what's been going on in Myanmar, or look at some of the bigotry that has been fueled among the Sinhalese clergy in Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's completely valid and it's completely true. I'm not sure if the Maltese example, though, Salil, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, is correct. That I think that was some woman who was investigating corruption or something. But is it true that people of all faiths commit crimes? Yes. Is it true that people from any religious tradition can find ways or find reasons to be violent and attack people who they perceive as attacking their faith? Yes, of course. But I think the liberal failure over here is one on timing. So when something happens, when something horrendous happens that is in the name of radical Islam or appears to be motivated by radical Islam, at that moment, we don't step in and then say, well, let's also have a discussion about Sri Lanka. Because when you do that, even though you may be well-meaning, when you do that, you appear as though you do not want to have that hard conversation about radical Islam. You should definitely have that hard conversation about all kinds of radicalism, but there is a time and a place. And when something like Charlie Hebdo happens, when something like Salman Rushdie happens, then most people who look at it, regular people, they look at it and they say that, well, look, this is the problem. We want intellectuals and writers to address the problem. We're speaking on Saturday. Maybe a week from now, you have another show and we take a sort of, a view of all of these different movements across the planet. How does religion inform them? To what degree does religion inspire radicalization? I think that's perfectly valid. But I think that the failure to look at a particular ideology and a particular strand in the immediate aftermath, right? So if like Charlie Hebdo happens and the next day the discussion you want to have is about Sri Lanka, I'm very sorry, but people are going to look at you and say that, hey, wait a minute, why can't we have the discussion about what just happened?
Yeah, I actually think that's a really important point. And I think, Amitav, that the case could be made that the liberal position, or that even Salman Rushdie himself and his liberties have been weakened by the failure to call out moments where they need to be unequivocally called out as such. And that while it is important that you bring up all of these other examples and you speak about journalists who are jailed in India or elsewhere in the world, that may be a meta free speech debate, but it does not speak to what has happened with Rushdie, who has lived with a fatwa on his head for more than 3 decades. And therefore, are you conflating, literally apples and oranges here when you should be focusing at least in this moment on the apples? Sorry, Salil, are you trying to say something there, Salil?
That Sadanand, I mean, your argument is well made for certain kinds of liberals, perhaps, but it probably doesn't hold water in this group, certainly, for sure. I mean, Amitava was one of the 4 who read out from Satanic Verses at the Jaipur Literature Festival, if I remember well. Yeah, Hari Kundru, Ruchir Joshi, and Jeet Thayil who did that. So, and I remember writing a piece in Mint at that time, where I had a column at that time, where I said that this is the Fab 4 referring to the Beatles, and that these are my Fab 4 for what they did at that time. So let's not forget that. I mean, I wrote the editorial in India Today in 1989. When Satanic.
How many people, but Salil, how many people who are watching this show know that?
No,
this is the problem, right? We can't be so incestuous and clubby. We have to be able to appeal to and reason with a general audience that is out there. Because if we don't make these arguments, the people who are going to make the arguments and command this debate are the people who are going to use this, and we know how they're going to use this. They're going to use this to
let's bring in Amitav. Let's
kind of castigate all of Islam. We know that they're going to use it. How many people who are viewing this, sort of know that you wrote some article and called by some guys Fab 4, or that Amitav read from this? I think that's great, and I think your point is well taken. That the people over here, I mean, Aatish has written tons of articles and books condemning radical Islam. This is not the group. You're absolutely right. I'm making a larger point. I'm saying that at this moment, when this happens in the moment, we have to be able to address the issue that presents itself.
I actually see that point, and I want to take it to Amitav, because really really the examples you gave were, I think Sadanand's point is, we could be talking another day about diminishing freedoms. Where does, free speech become hate speech? What about jailed journalists? What about, I don't know, the state of TV news in India? But that day is not today. Salman Rushdie has been threatened by Islamists for years, and now they have converted their threat into reality. And I think the point that Sadanand is saying is that we need to be able to say that without adding 10 other points to it. Your response.
Okay.
Yeah, coming first Amitabh, then Aatish. Yes.
You know, this is the moment actually to bring in all the issues and to bring it out incisively and clearly. So let me try to do that very quickly. Barkha, at your alma mater, Columbia, Rushdie delivered a speech in 1991, I think, where he said, what minority is smaller and weaker than a minority of one? And he was referring to his case. He was referring to the case where states and institutions disregard individual writers and where their lives are weighed against all kinds of business interests or other interests, and writers are inconsequential. Now, the truth of the moment is that writers are indeed irrelevant largely and largely marginal in our societies. But Rushdie transcends those limitations. And when something like this happens, Rushdie is precisely the way in which we need to get to the condition of all writers and threatened journalists. A journalist like Siddiq Kappan, who goes to UP to report on the Hathras case, a rape case, and is then jailed and put into jail, and he has not been released, is precisely what we need to bring out when we are discussing Salman Rushdie. Because those issues, this is the way Rushdie's own interests as the former president of PEN has been to speak about liberation and freedom of speech for all writers. And I think it is therefore particularly relevant that when we are discussing his case, we discuss the causes he supports. And in that case, we say that this is a reason to bring to the fore how precisely the forces that have struck at him are also the same forces of intolerance and bigotry that threaten writers.
So that would be my question. Do you believe that Siddiq Kappan is a comparable example?
Yes.
Is it? Hang on, because there is no institutional religious body affiliated to a powerful state that has declared a bounty on Siddiq Kappan's head. You can argue about the essential injustice of what he's going through, the laws that make it possible, the marginalization of Muslims in India, and it would still not be the same as a fatwa by the Ayatollah of Iran.
Right.
Not exactly the same, you're right, but congruent, because it is in exactly the kind of anti-Muslim bigotry that allows Adityanath to put a man with a Muslim name into jail. Hindutva and its institutional hold, and how the public in India accepts what a Muslim name denotes, allows a certain oppressive order to get away with murder.
Okay, I want to bring in Aatish at this point because, I think a lot of people watching the show would say this is where liberals miss the point. And I'll tell you what's happening in India. People are actually picking up Nupur Sharma, the suspended spokeswoman of the BJP, and drawing an equivalence between her and Rushdie and saying, and this was said to me today, that if you're going to stand for Salman's right to free speech, why are you not standing for Nupur Sharma's right to make the comments she did about the Prophet? For the record, I do not believe Nupur Sharma should be jailed, and I do not believe Muhammad Zubair should have been jailed. I don't believe anyone should be jailed unless they're doing something to incite violence. But the problem is there's so many ifs and buts on the sides that we all choose when it comes to free speech that it becomes a problem and a self-defeating conversation. Aatish, sorry, go ahead.
Two things. Firstly, unequivocally, I stand for Nupur Sharma's right for free speech. But because two people are the victim of the same crime, like a mugger can come and mug a sublime artist, and a mugger can come and mug someone who's a little bit of a crook, a rabble rouser, a bigot. So what I don't want to see is for Nupur Sharma and Salman Rushdie, one being the sublime artist, the other being a pretty hateful little bigot, clubbed together just because they're the victim of the same crime. We absolutely stand for her right to speak, and her right to speak unmolested, unthreatened by violence. I wanted to come to this other point of equivalences. Here we are, I am in upstate New York. I'm very close to or reasonably close to the place where the crime was committed. Very recently, a white guy drives several hundred kilometers, shoots up a mall, kills a bunch of black people. As writers, our job is to make things interesting, and as liberals, to bring in the human element. Now, when I think of that white person getting radicalized on his own with computer information, deciding to buy the gun, preparing to make the crime, and then I think of the person who has attacked Rushdie yesterday, I see an experience that seems to me like, from the point of view of a writer, as shared and interesting and important. And both people have been receiving stimulus. You're right, that the fact that the man who attacked Rushdie would have been getting sanction from an Ayatollah is very different from somebody getting sanction from white supremacists and things like that. But the actual experience of this individual assailant coming to commit this crime one morning and basically overturning all our lives because he's done this, that for me is to look, to humanize that, to dramatize that. That is the natural province of the liberal and the writer.
Yeah, but on this point of not clubbing Nupur Sharma with Salman Rushdie, how would you explain that to the hundreds of thousands of people today who are saying, see, this is what could happen to Nupur Sharma next? Because that, by the way, is a conversation that is taking place in large sections of the Hindu right-wing, sort of commentary section today. Aatish, briefly, and then I'll take it around the panel. Aatish?
I think I said it like for sure. They can both be charged with the same thing. They can be facing the same threat. It doesn't make them the same person. You know, one was producing a sublime work of art, has a long career, and in that way. So when the voice of somebody like that is threatened, it's a little bit different from the voice of a rabid bigot being threatened. Although we will defend both, unequivocally, we will defend both.
Yeah, I guess that, Salil, the argument could be made that bigotry and what's sublime and not is subjective. I'm not saying that's what I think. I don't see the equivalence, but I absolutely do not think that Nupur Sharma should be sent to jail. I completely think that she was in a hate-enabling backdrop of television news, and the intent was that, but I don't think she should be jailed. And that is my position. And I think the real hypocrisy is the same journalist cheering on the arrest of a fact checker like Mohammed Zubair, by contrast. But to all of those who are going to turn around and say, as so many have said to me today, you hypocrite Barkha, you defend Rushdie, but you don't defend Nupur Sharma. Actually, by the way, I do defend her against the right to remain a free citizen. Salil, go ahead.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I completely agree with everything Aatish said. And this takes us back that, we are debating these points on these terms because of the way social media forces debates on people today about the false equivalences. And, Nupur Sharma is not a writer to start with. So the comparison with Salman is completely incorrect because, she's a politician, she's a lawyer, and lawyers are meant to argue and make points forcefully. So I was also asked about it. What about Nupur Sharma? And I said, any question that begins with what about, I, yawn usually because I think it's completely irrelevant. But one, she has a right to say what she wants to say. And that means she has a right to be a bigot if that's what she wants to be. She should not be prosecuted. You're talking about jail. I don't even think there should be charges against her, to be honest. So she should not be prosecuted. She has a right to remain free from fear. But, and this is where the but comes in, BJP has a right to sack her if it wants to, right? That's the point.
Because that's not against free speech. That's them disowning her politically.
The only action against her is not taken by somebody. I mean, there are idiots who have probably said off with her head, but the only practical action against her was taken by the BJP because it found that the Gulf states were angry and it was affecting India's bottom line, to use the title of your program. So I think that's where the rubber hits the road, and we just have to bear that in mind. That's all.
Yeah, Sadanand?
Many of the people attacking you on social media or attacking, who are making that point on social media are kind of half blind, right? Because there is nobody over here, not you, there's nobody else here, nobody on this panel who says that Nupur Sharma should be jailed. There's nobody on this panel who thinks Nupur Sharma should be attacked. Everybody on this panel would condemn such an attack if it were to occur, and so on, right? So the imaginary argument that they are fighting, it actually doesn't exist, because it's not a point that you or anyone over here has made. What they are in fact upset about is that why do we seem to be more vocal about what happened to Rushdie, and why are we less vocal? I think that's what they're coming down to. And I think that is perfectly, that can be explained very easily. And I think Aatish, in fact, did explain it. That I will, there are people whose thoughts I want to engage with, and whose books I will buy, and whose lectures I will listen to. Similarly, I mean, and there are people who I won't. And so I don't think that just because I happen to believe that Salman Rushdie contributes more to human civilization than Nupur Sharma, with all due respect to the art form that is Times Now, it doesn't mean anything, right? Am I saying that she should be threatened? No. Am I saying she should be jailed? No. I'm not even saying she should be off Times Now. If she wants to go and sort of do her performance art there, that's fine by me. All I'm saying is that I personally feel more touched by Salman Rushdie's work than by the work of the great author Nupur Sharma, and I'm entitled to that feeling.
Okay, Amitav, we have to start closing, but let me bring Amitav here. The United States of America, we speak a lot about diminishing freedoms in India. The United States of America is going through a lot of its own diminishing freedoms. And I think that for us as Indians to not be rankled by the constant sort of moral lecturing, we may feel a lot of these things ourselves, but to see what's happening with, the gun lobbies, the rights of women, abortion, what's happened with Salman Rushdie. I mean, do you think that this is going to translate into a conversation beyond what Sadanand calls these clubby liberal conversations?
I don't know. When I was going to sleep last night, I thought, well, next semester I'm teaching a prison course, a course in literature in a prison up here in upstate New York. And I thought, if this guy were my student in the prison, what would I be teaching this person? And I'm asking that question to you, or presenting it to your audience, because that is a question that a teacher might ask, or a journalist might ask, or a writer might ask about how to promote discourse in society, how to produce a genuinely healthy civil society. And now, I think there has been increasing polarization in America and increasing polarization in India. And the idea of there actually being a genuine conversation or a discussion is precisely what is threatened, and what this tragedy also reveals. So all of us, in many ways, have to try to find more and more inventive ways, and I hope your program is a step in that direction, on how to carry on discussions on issues which promote conversation and resist polarization. Unfortunately, social media, which has been blamed for some things in this conversation, actually leads to greater polarization, because we only encounter people who speak and talk like us, or whose views are reflected back to us. And so, if you have any ideas,
nothing like me,
do write to me about what I should be teaching.
Well, I think Sadanand had some disagreement in this conversation.
I said, I don't know what social media you're on, because I only seem to encounter people who think and speak nothing like me.
Yeah, but then you can't have a conversation with them. I think the catch is, where do you find people who disagree with you, whom you can have an actual conversation with, right?
Exactly.
Now, hang on, guys. I've got 5 minutes left, but I want to talk a little bit about India and the Indian context. And while some of you made comments about what's happening with journalists, in the BJP years, not many of you picked up how this began in India. I mean, we have to remind our audience that we were the first country in the world. Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister. Ashok Gehlot was the Chief Minister of Rajasthan when the talk by Salman Rushdie was cancelled. And in my opinion, Aatish, I'll start with you, because I know you've documented not just the bigotry that you've seen in the hard Hindu right, but also the hypocrisies, the secular hypocrisies, as it were, of the Congress party. And these are really those chickens in some ways coming home to roost.
I mean, absolutely. I think that the seeds for the demise of our secular ideals, our secular republic, was sown in those Congress years. Terrible, terrible. And I think in many ways, they did such a disservice to Muslims by playing that politics, and they made them a target. And so I completely, but I mean, at the same time, obviously, as much as the Romanovs paved the way for the coming of the Bolsheviks, or the Shah paved the way for the Ayatollah, we have to understand that whatever the Congress did do, these guys do much worse. So, I mean, you can for sure trace an arc, and certainly my books have always felt in many ways both the dangers of that Indian elitism, the way, the remove at which Indian elites have lived in relation to people, and the kind of ways that they've invited a sort of destruction upon themselves. But now that destruction has come, we have to turn our gaze elsewhere.
Salil?
Completely agree with Aatish. I mean, India's record on free speech has been bad for a long. I wrote a short book mainly focusing on Hindu nationalism. But if you look back at the examples there, the number of books that have been banned, from the time of Nehru onward, is large. And that doesn't mean that others haven't. I mean, even the communists banned Dikondito by Taslim Nasreen, for example, as one example, and when they were in power in Bengal. And Narendra Modi, who spoke up about when he was the chief minister of Gujarat, tried to ban Joseph Laliwald and Jaswant Singh's books that came out at that time. So nobody is wearing very white clothes here just now. That we have to be very clear about. And absolutely, I mean, but I completely agree with Aatish that Congress had put in place certain laws which are being perfected and used more effectively by the current regime without following the Queensberry rules of boxing, as it were. And the disenchantment that the Hindu middle class and upper middle class have had with Congress party begins not just with the banning of satanic verses, but the Shah Banu judgment, which was around the same time, 87, 88. I was a young reporter in India at that time, and I've written both those stories. I mean, I very vividly remember that, and I was as appalled as all of us on this table would be about the Shah Banu verdict and about the, and again, to be clear, satanic verses was never banned in India. What was banned,
I mean, yeah, the import of it was
banned, and no publisher in India wanted to publish it. I think we have to be clear. This is not to give a free pass to Congress, because I would wish somebody were to publish it, and it would be a great challenge if someone were to try to publish it today in India in this climate, which is so hostile to Islam, and see where it goes. But I don't think anybody is going to take it up.
Amitava?
Liberals, again, in trying to blame the Congress as much as we clearly have thought of the, blaming the Hindutva folks, I'm not in favor of that. Not because the Congress doesn't have dirty hands, but because the speed, the velocity with which hate has been spread in recent years, and the divide along religious lines that allows for attacks of this kind in India, at least, means that I want to blame a particular party and a particular order of a more recent vintage with greater.
But you can't. But that party, in blaming that party, you are escaping the historicity of this conversation around free speech.
No, what's
I mean, you're free to call out the BJP on diminishing freedoms, but you can't ignore the historicity of what we're talking about today.
Say, that's cool.
Okay, Sadanand?
Yeah, I mean, I agree on this question of Congress, but I bring it back to the point I raised earlier. In 2022, is this the time for us to be debating the many crimes of omission and commission of the Congress party? No. If we were to take the broad historical view, absolutely, you're right. Rajiv Gandhi dropped the ball on and there were many such many such cases. But right now, what we face, the main threat to freedom of speech and freedom of expression in India comes from an ideology that doesn't really recognize these and is not rooted in the Enlightenment, and it's in many ways is at odds with it. That's the reality that Indians face. And so this is not the time to make those arguments. So I think, if you're doing something, if this is a longer program or we're talking of a book length treatment, it's important context. And many of the people, in fact, I think all of the people on this panel have talked about it. But I will bring it back to the initial point I made, which is by the same logic, this is the moment where we must be able to have a frank conversation about the particular ideological sources of violence that led to this tragic incident. And we don't do ourselves any favors. We don't do liberalism any favors by using this fraught moment to have this wider conversation. I think this fraught we should have separate discussions, and we should, and we do indeed. And I would just sort of point out that when something horrible happens in the name of Hindu nationalism, all of us condemn it and all of us discuss it. We don't then turn around and say that let's also have a conversation about what's happening in Lebanon. So I think that's sort of, and by not doing that, I think we cede ground to people who are only too willing to capture that ground, to discredit liberals as hypocrites, and to use tragedies like the tragedy that occurred yesterday to smear and attack all Muslims.
Okay, Aatish, I'm going to give you the last word, which I think should take us back to Salman, his hopes for a freer life. And if you just want to read out a little bit of a passage that may speak more than any of us, more eloquently than any of us possibly could, I'll leave it to you to do that for us.
Thank you for that, because I think in the end, the writer's words are the part that's most immortal, and this heartbreaking feeling of safety that Salman felt here. This is from Joseph Anton. If America would let him come and stay quietly on American soil and take his chances, then maybe that was the best possibility of finding some freedom in the short term. Maybe he could achieve a part-time freedom at least for a month, a year, or 2 or 3, while he was fighting for an end to the threats. What was he, after all, but a huddled mass yearning to breathe free? He heard the song of the statue in the harbor, and she seemed to be singing to him.
It's actually chilling, and thank you for that. I think that says everything about hopes and crushed hopes, but also important conversations raised in the aftermath of what's happened. And I think we have to be able to have an honest conversation. That is the bottom line. Maybe we don't have the perfect answers, but we still have to ask the blunt questions. Thank you so much for helping me do a little bit of that with my hoarse, croaky throat this evening. Salil, Tripathi, Aatish, Taseer, Amitava, Kumar, and Sadanand Dhume. Thank you, and with hopes that Salman Rushdie makes it off that ventilator and gets his voice and his words back. I think an entire universe is waiting to read more of him. Thank you very much. Take care.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.